Alright folks, welcome back. It's your dedicated Spartan. If you're wondering why I haven't uploaded a video lately, it's because I've been extremely busy training to become a professional fighter. Yes, it's official. I've also been working on building a series so you guys can see my training from me working on my horrible stand-up striking to making it way better than what it is now. Staying humble and learning on that journey. We'll be doing that in the future. But for now, we are going to talk about, does the UFC have the best? And I'm going to focus on a couple of people. It's going to be a series. I'm going to do more than one video. Right now, I'm going to focus on three people who I think people often forget about when they talk about does the UFC has the best. I'm also going to come up with a couple of other people when they're where I'm talking, but mainly three. And I want to talk about Robbie Lawler, Tyron Woodley, and Luke Rockhold. Now, I'll go from the worst to probably the best. Worst, we'll have the worst, medium, and then the best. And one of them would be Rockhold. And I'm not saying he was a horrible fighter before everyone says you're stupid, you don't know what you're talking about. Just bear with me for a minute. I'm talking about compared to their reign as champions inside the UFC. You have a lot of really good fighters in the UFC who didn't reach championship. You have a lot of really good fighters in the UFC who were cut before they were given the opportunity to reach the championship. Personally, I think one of the best middleweights on the planet, and probably in the top 10 of all time, top 5 maybe even in my opinion, is Gegard Mousasi. Fought in the UFC, didn't come from the UFC, never got a UFC title shot, but did more than enough to earn it. He finished everybody, just about everybody he fought, except for Lyoto Machida. He later avenged that loss. It went to the distance both times. But before that, he knocked out Vitor Belfort, who had knocked out Luke Rockhold and Michael Bisping both. Both those guys wound up getting title shots. Vitor Belfort got one as well, but he was destroyed by Chris Weidman. Gegard Mousasi knocked him out. He knocked out Vitor Belfort, he knocked out Dan Henderson, got TKO'd by Uriah Hall, then came back and avenged that loss to Uriah Hall. And not only did he avenge that loss, but the first time he lost, he was winning. Kind of like Rose Namajunas versus Jessica Andrade the first time, or Stephen Thompson versus Anthony Pettis. Was losing the fight, got knocked out very close to the end of the second round, both those fighters. But let's talk about Luke Rockhold. Came from Strikeforce, beat Jacare Souza to earn the Strikeforce Middleweight Championship, defended the Strikeforce Middleweight Championship. Strikeforce folds, goes into the UFC, and never goes the distance. He loses his debut to Vitor Belfort with that famous spinning back kick to the face. But after that, goes out and destroys Lyoto Machida, who was a light heavyweight champion, who had fought Jon Jones, gave him a very good fight, beat Michael Bisping, earned the shot to fight Chris Weidman, who everyone was hyping up, was undefeated at the time, and then fought a very good back and forth fight in the first few rounds, but from the end of round 3 to round 4 was all Rockhold. He just utterly destroyed Weidman. And here's the thing. A lot of people say, well, the UFC has the best. We admit that. But if you go back and read old articles in 2012 and 2013 and 14, when Rockhold first got into the UFC, people, I understand a lot of them are casuals, but the reason people call them casuals is because the people who are usually paying the money, the ones who are buying those pay-per-views, those are mostly casual fans. So that's why you want to kind of please them as an organization. Your first job is to make money. It is not per se to always put on the best fights. It's to make money. So I can't blame them when they do that. But people did not expect Rockhold to do well, especially against Anderson Silva. He was the big name at the time. He still is. I'm going to do a video about him, talk about his title run, because I was very, very much a fan of his. But they didn't expect Rockhold to make it there. He got the belt, beat an undefeated champion in the UFC, and after that, the tide of people had changed. They were like, okay, I expect him to reign for a very long time because of how he got there. A lot of people get there through, some razor-close decisions, some wars, some very, very hard fights to get there, and then people are like, well, they might need some rest before they go and fight. But some people destroy, and they take the belt. Rockhold took the belt like he meant it. And then he ran to Michael Bisping, who he'd already beaten. Bisping came in there as a huge underdog, 2 weeks notice, was 37 years old. Rockhold was 31, prime of his life. And then Rockhold got utterly knocked out in the first round. So if you want to compare and say, well, people who come to the UFC don't do too well, a lot of people bring up guys who didn't make it to the top. But, I'm bringing up a guy who did. Rockhold made it to the top. Yes, after that, his only victory since then has been against David Branch. He lost to Yoel Romero, and he lost to Jan Blachowicz. But that was moving up in weight class, so people give him forgiveness for that. And a lot of people also bring into question his chin. Like, is his chin bad? He doesn't necessarily have a bad chin. Same with Cody Garbrandt. Cody Garbrandt has a good chin. Rockhold At 205, I'll say not as good because people hit harder there, and they're heavier, they're going to do more damage. And also, Jan, I told you I learned about transferring weight in my punches properly. Transferred that left that he hit him with was a very, very good left, and it knocked Rockhold out. But Rockhold ate punches from Machida and Weidman and David Branch before that. Those guys hit pretty hard, but you got to work on your defense. So he was Strikeforce champion, came to the UFC, became undisputed middleweight champion, had never gone the distance in the UFC up to that point, and then got knocked out by the underdog in their fight. And he was, behaving, not wisely. He was fumbling with his mouthpiece. He kept on loosening it out. The mouthpiece helps keep you from being knocked out. It's hard to knock somebody out if they have a mouthpiece in their mouth. His defense already has bad holes in it, and he was, expressing even more so. He was overconfident in that fight, and he was doing other things wrong, like leaning into his punches too much. You're not supposed to do that. I'll discuss that later in my series about how far I've come personally in training to be a fighter myself. Next, let's talk about Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler, I believe, if I'm correct, was 19-9 when he got a title shot finally against Johnny Hendricks. And he had been champion in Elite XC and Strikeforce, so he had been around. He was in the UFC, but that he was there in the earlier days before they had the really, really good competition that they had now. He was fighting. He did fight Nick Diaz, who was very good competition, but before that, he fought people who didn't quite go as far as he had in the sport, or even when he was in the UFC. I'm talking about his UFC competition. I know Jacare Souza, he fought him, and he fought Shogun Rua. He fought those guys, and those guys, you mentioned them, somebody knows who those guys are. But when he beat guys like Tiki Gosan in the earlier days in the UFC, not a lot of people knew about them. So he beat those guys, left the UFC, went out, won 2 or 3 other championships. I got to double check. He won a lot of championships. Then he came back to the UFC years later. And like I said, now people like Robbie Lawler, they respect him as, championship caliber. But go back and read what the articles were saying about him in 2012, 2011, when he first came back. Underdog, again, people were not expecting him to do well in his comeback to the UFC. Fought Johnny Hendricks 2 times. And here's the thing I want to point out. GSP did not do that. GSP refused to do that. And when I say refused, I mean he retired. Now, a lot of people, and this is not disrespect to any fighter, it is smart if you think you're going to lose a fight and you don't take it. And GSP never called himself the best ever. He never did. So I'm not holding that against him. I'm talking about when someone else is comparing 2 fighters, you have to keep the same. If you're going to say a fighter has to fight the best to be the best, if you say that about one fighter, you got to apply that to every fighter. GSP fought Johnny Hendricks once, and it was controversial in a lot of people's minds. A lot of people felt GSP should have lost that fight, and justifiably so if you actually watch the fight. It was still a close fight. I don't disagree with that when people say that. That fight was still pretty close, because a lot of people talk about the scarring on GSP's face. Hey, Bisping, when he defended his belt against Dan Henderson, looked way worse than Henderson did. I don't even think Henderson had a scratch on his face. But I watched that fight. It was not even close as to, that was not a robbery. Bisping clearly beat Henderson. He outfought him. I don't say outboxed because a lot of people will say the person that had more punches, they should have won. No. This is MMA. Kicks, knees, elbows, those all count as landing strikes. But he clearly lost. I'm talking about Dan Henderson. But GSP fought Johnny Hendricks one time. Got beat up pretty badly. Not saying whether he was robbery or not. I might be talking about that. I'm just talking about the truth. The truth was he got beaten up badly. You could see that on his face, and you can tell by how slow he was talking afterwards. He went to the hospital. He retired because of how rough that fight was. So, during that period, you had a lot of welterweight killers coming up. You had Rory McDonald. You had Carlos Condit, a.k.a. the natural-born killer. You had Robbie Lawler. So it was pretty stacked. And you had Johnny Hendricks. It was pretty stacked. Robbie Lawler fights Johnny Hendricks twice. A lot of people felt that Robbie Lawler should have won the first fight. A lot of people felt he should have lost the second fight. Regardless, I'm not talking about who should have won, who should have lost. 10 rounds. He went 10 rounds with Johnny Hendricks. And he did well in both. He fought in both fights. That's the point. He fought in both fights. Wins the belt. Defends it against Roy McDonald. You guys, if you've seen my video on Robbie Lawler, you know I love that fight. It is, in my opinion, the best title fight in UFC history. Definitely the best welterweight fight, probably, period. I have to watch other organizations to make that just. I'll watch before I judge. But from what I've seen so far, best welterweight fight of all time, best UFC title fight of all time. Zhang Weili versus Joanna came pretty close. That was a really good fight too. But a really good fight. So he went through these wars to hold on to that belt. Came back in the last round and finishes Rory McDonald. Then he fights Carlos Condit. And, style makes fights. I've always thought that, Robbie Lawler was a very prime Robbie Lawler. That Robbie Lawler who fought Rory McDonald and Johnny Hendricks was a horrible matchup for GSP. Because, Johnny had that big right hand, but Robbie had some very versatile striking. He could kick, he could knee, he could elbow, and he could punch. He had power in both hands, and he was a southpaw. And he had very good takedown defense. And wrestling was one of the additions that GSP had. And people will say, well, Sam, Nick Diaz knocked out Robbie Lawler. GSP beat Robbie Lawler. Guys, just because one guy beats somebody does not mean he matches up against the other guy very well. I think people, need to understand that. The skills make a difference. Like Carlos Condit, his style was running around and striking. Robbie was not going to take him down the same way that GSP was going to. That's why that was a stand-up. That's why that was a stand-up fight, because of Robbie's fighting style. If Carlos Condit had fought Khabib at welterweight, Khabib was going to take him down. Khabib's not going to stand up with him and try to strike. If he fights somebody like Israel Adesanya at welterweight, Stephen Thompson at welterweight, that's going to be a stand-up fight, because Stephen Thompson's a counter striker. He's a stand-up fighter. He's not going to try to put him on the ground. So they're going to come out differently when you juggle these guys up and fight them. Robbie Lawler defends it against Condit. Now, that was highly controversial. A lot of people felt that Robbie should have lost that fight. I watched that fight, and here's the way I saw it. I could give the third round to Robbie based upon the rules. Could. I wouldn't, complain. I wouldn't call it a robbery either way. It was a close fight. Robbery is when the guy wins 4 rounds and the other guy maybe won 1 round and they give it to him. That's a robbery. But when we're 2-2 going into the 5th, or the guy might have lost 3 rounds, but the 2 rounds he won were 10-8 rounds. He knocked the guy down 2 or 3 times, or he took him down and pounded him the same way Robbie Lawler pounded Ben Askren for the majority of the fight. For 2 rounds. And then the other guy, edged out his rounds, kind of like Stephen Thompson versus Jorge Masvidal. He's just edging him out. He wasn't utterly destroying him in those rounds. He wasn't, cutting his face up, knocking him down multiple times, just doing enough to make it a 10-9 round. Those are close fights. That's the kind of fight Robbie had with him. Even though Carlos did score a lot more points, in that 5th round, some people might judge the 5th round 10-8 for Robbie rather than 10-9. So that's 1 less point for Condit if he won the 3rd round, and then 1 extra point for Robbie if he won the 3rd round. So, the fight's pretty close. And like I said, for the last full minute, all Condit could do, he dropped his hands and was, dodging, trying to stay up on his feet. Because Robbie, when he hit him with that right hand, he really hurt him. But then after that, loses it to the 3rd man we're going to talk about, and that's Tyrant Woodley. Tyrant Woodley didn't come out of the UFC. Came from Strikeforce. And yeah, I know the UFC bought Strikeforce. My point is, those fighters fought there. He comes, and he just lost the belt. Well, not just now, but he lost it last year, 2019. So if we look at it, for the better part of the last decade in the welterweight division, which is really what made the UFC, in my opinion, famous. I know we had Forrest Griffin and we had Anderson Silva in middleweight and light heavyweight, but people talked about, more people knew who GSP and Matt Hughes was that I met personally than they even did, like Carlos Condit or those guys. People knew who Anderson Silva was as well. So Anderson Silva really would be middleweight, if you want to argue that. Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, Matt Hughes, and GSP. Those were the 4 big names that I would hear people who did not follow fighting, but they knew who those guys were. They knew them, very, very well. So welterweight and middleweight, and Jon Jones, he was light heavyweight, but they didn't really know the light heavyweights. But they knew who Anderson Silva was. They knew who GSP was. They knew who Matt Hughes was. GSP was kind of the face of it. So for the better part of the last decade, from 2014 into 19, it was held by Robbie Lawler and Tyrant Woodley. The welterweight belt was. Now, Robbie Lawler, like I said, he did fight in the UFC in the earlier days in his career, but he left the UFC for a long time. When he came back, people didn't think he was top UFC competition. And judging by fighting people in the UFC, he wasn't. He fought guys, like I said, people whose names, aside from Nick Diaz, they don't really remember who he fought in the UFC in his earlier days. And also those guys' records, show they didn't last as long in there either. but he got the UFC welterweight belt. And when he fought Rory McDonald, he was an underdog. When he fought Carlos Condit, he was an underdog. People expected him to lose those fights. You want to argue about robbery with Condit? Fine. Robbie Lawler knocked out Rory McDonald. He finished him, so there's no maybe there to him winning. That win is 100% his. So the point is, against, the best who they expected to beat him, he did very well. And then Tyron Woodley. Now, yes, I am not going to deny that Tyrant Woodley versus Stephen Thompson 2 was not the most exciting fight. At the same time, I'm actually not 100% against technical fights. One of my favorite fights was Masakatsu Funaki versus Bas Rutten. And Bas himself admits the first 15 minutes of that fight are pretty boring, because he's trying not to strike because he didn't want to burn any energy, and he's waiting till after 15 minutes to just pour strikes onto Funaki, which is exactly what he did, and he utterly destroyed him. The last 3 minutes of the fight are very brutal, as a matter of fact. But, Woodley was patient, knocks Thompson down in the 5th round, beats him up. But, don't forget how he got there. He beat Carlos Condit coming out of Strikeforce. And a lot of people argue, well, Carlos Condit's knee blew out. But like Woodley said, it blew out because he took him down. Now, as far as I know, I didn't hear Carlos saying, I came in there with an injured knee. His knee was fine. His knee got injured during the fight while Woodley was taking him down. To me, that's the same as somebody complaining, saying, oh, you won the fight because you broke my jaw. Well, yeah, I broke your jaw because I punched you. He blew his knee out because he took him down. So he had a legitimate win over Carlos Condit, who had just fought for the belt. After that, the only person who he lost to in getting to the belt was Rory McDonald. Rory McDonald wound up fighting Robbie Lawler. Very good fight. Almost got that belt. Came really close, but didn't quite do it. And then he beats Stephen Thompson twice. The first fight was great. Beats Damian Maia. And to get the belt, knocked Robbie Lawler out in the first round. Now, Robbie never complained about it. And I'm not going to whine and say Woodley could not beat Robbie Lawler. Woodley matched up very well against Robbie Lawler because he had that very good wrestling and he could strike standing up. And Robbie's style of fighting was fit for him. He wasn't going to try to out-wrestle Woodley, but Woodley knocked him out. Do I think the damage from the previous fights affected that? Yes, that's the way of the game. You can never say, oh, that damage didn't bother me next fight. It's going to affect you. Unless you get full time to heal up, and if you do fully heal, it's not going to bother you. So, we have Tyrant Woodley now. Held the belt for a pretty long time, had some very good title defenses. Then, Darren Till came, undefeated, was knocking out everybody with that left hand of his, or at least giving them technical knockouts. A couple of the fights when he was in, he knocked the guy down 2, 3, 4 times. Could have finished him sooner, but was kind of showboating a bit and didn't quite knock him out. But the point was, he had a lot of power, and he's a really big welterweight. He's fighting at middleweight now. That lets you know he was a big welterweight, making a huge cut to get down there and fight Woodley. People were hyping Darren Till up like he was going to snatch the belt from Woodley. Not all of them. Some of them were, some weren't, but quite a few people. I remember them saying, oh, Darren Till's about to take the belt from Woodley. And Tyrant Woodley rolled up Darren Till and beat him up like he was his big brother. He beat him down pretty badly. So when people argue what happens when people come to the UFC and they get destroyed, they like to talk about Ben Askren. They like to talk about I can't think of the guy's name now, but he fought at middleweight. But he was a very small middleweight. People don't realize people weight cut and make big weight cuts. And weight cutting is basically legal cheating. The whole point of weight classes is so really big guys don't fight really small guys. But if this guy's 190 pounds and he can cut down to 145, he's fighting on a guy who's 145, might be 160 naturally. Cutting 15 pounds versus, I said, 190 to 145. What's that? 45 pounds. Making a big weight cut to get down there. So he's going to have a huge advantage. The point is, though, against some good fighters. Stephen Thompson, very good fighter. Damian Maia, excellent fighter. He strangled out Carlos Condit in the first round after his loss to Robbie Lawler. If you want to say loss, that's fine. Like I said, it was a close fight. But the point is, he strangled him in the first round. But Damian Maia did. Damian Maia, legit challenge. Darren Till, even though I do think he was being pushed a little too soon, he still had a lot of power, still a big dude. But Tyron Woodley just, out-wrestled him and just beat him down. But Stephen Thompson 2 times and Robbie Lawler. Very good champion. People didn't want to see Tyron Woodley win that fight, but he did. And then Carlos Condit. He beat Carlos Condit too. So you got to talk about those guys too. If you want to talk about, look how Ben Askren did coming from ONE FC. Well, let's compare them. Ben Askren came there after a year plus of retirement. He hadn't fought in a year. He hadn't been trained to fight for a year. And then he went and he got beaten. I'm not going to lie, he got beaten by a lot of people were overlooking. Okay, but you got to talk about Robbie Lawler too, coming back after a long time and getting the belt. You got to talk about Tyrant Woodley. I know a lot of people don't like him, but hey, he knocked Robbie Lawler out. He beat Stephen Thompson down to a draw first time. Close fight. That's why it was a draw. Then he beat Stephen Thompson down the second time. 5th round. Beat Damian Maia. That one was boring. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. Beat Darren Till. So when y'all want to talk about people coming into the organization and losing, you got to also talk about the guys who win. Keep it the same.